and welcome to Chapter 4. In previous episodes, we have seen that climate change is a systemic threat and we're quite close to going over critical planetary thresholds, critical boundaries, at a rate of 42 gigatons every year. And for 1.5 degrees, we have 183 gigatons left, and we have about 20 years left for 2 degrees C. This chapter is going to zoom in on this 42 gigatons per year, and we're going to see exactly how fast each individual nation is going to have to reduce its emissions to get it down to zero so that we don't go over these planetary thresholds. This chapter is a unique insight into those national responsibilities, and it's known as the CUTx numbers or the CUTx index. Our backs are really against the wall, and we've known about climate change for decades, and yet in those decades fossil fuel companies have made on average over $2 billion every day, pushing us closer to these lines. We only have 183 gigatons, like 4 years worth of CO2 left, and yet governments are still globally subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So we have to make some pretty stark choices about our future. We can deal with numbers. It's not a problem. We have numbers for GDP, we have numbers for inflation, we have very precise targets. And when COVID happened, there was a whole load of numbers out there. There were dashboards created in days in order for governments to be held to account about the rates of infection and hospital beds and so on. But we just don't have a clear index, a clear image anywhere in the global news about how close we are to these tipping points. It's like the asteroid heading to Earth, and we haven't got any idea of when it will strike. We don't have a day or a date to control all our policy making by. Let's take the EU, for example, often considered by people to be a world leader in climate change policies. Well, what is their policy on climate change? And the answer is that they are committed to reducing emissions by at least 55% by the year 2030, based on 1990 levels. Yeah. What does that mean? Imagine, as a teacher, I give a student a report, and in the report I say, we expect that Jessica is going to improve her grades by 55% by the year 2030 based on what she was getting in primary school. Now, as a parent, if you got a report like that, you would demand the school to be much clearer about what exactly the teacher was saying. Like, what are they getting out of 10, for example? Some objective, clear, unambiguous level. Now, it's just odd. Because it's not just the EU, all across the globe we have countries making commitments in this extremely contorted way, which, and this is the fundamentally important point, has got nothing to do with the carbon budget. It's just a number based on a date in the future compared with a date in the past. Could we imagine a situation in which inflation or GDP was reported in such a twisted way? It wouldn't be acceptable. And so it begs the question, why do we accept that for this existential issue? The whole reporting process for policies is just absurd. Likewise, there's all kinds of media noise about carbon neutrality by a certain date or net zero by a certain date. But those dates tend to be things like 2050 or something. But why 2050? Maybe that's far too late. So the whole circus of media and political noise around climate change and the numbers is just an insane fog of confusion. Nobody has any clear idea about exactly where we are according to the carbon budget, according to science. Now, that's just crazy. And I'm sorry if my voice is a bit excited, but this is more than just a matter of like fiddling with an account sheet. This is about respecting the laws of physics and chemistry in order to safeguard the future of human civilization. So, here I am. I'm a philosophy teacher. And again, I've just got my little cups, my little kitchen stuff, and I was playing with like little Lego men before. So in a way you can ask a very legitimate question: why should we trust this bloke from Manchester? Well, of course the answer is these are not my numbers. In fact, in 2019, the climate scientists that we work with, Birgit van Munster and Michael Wadley, we had a day with Professor Kevin Anderson and the students, and he cross-checked and went through in detail every line of analysis which we have, and he concluded with this short statement.
Having discussed now with all the details behind the 11% estimate of the cuts that need to be made, particularly by the wealthier parts of the world, it's really heartening to see how this younger generation has taken the science and interpreted that as to what needs to be done, particularly, as I say, amongst the high emitting countries. And it fits very closely in terms of their conclusions with the work that colleagues and I have been undertaking at the University of Manchester and also at Uppsala in Sweden. So it's really good to see this level of scientific understanding and political integrity brought together to produce what is a very challenging but robust target that we all need to be using to inform our policies for the future.
So one last time, these numbers are based on the carbon budget. And as you saw in a previous episode, that carbon budget surely belongs to everybody equally. It's not fair if some people are using it up much faster than others. It makes a huge difference if you're Japanese or French or Polish. So the numbers have been broken down into nations. So each nation has a number of its responsibility for 1.5 and 2 degrees. I think the best way to start with this is to put up some comparisons. Let's put up the numbers for Sweden and the numbers for India. India has a population of over 1 billion, and it has far, far lower levels of consumption per capita than Sweden. Swedish people buy far more products on Amazon. They replace their cars, laptops and phones far more often. They travel a lot more than the average Indian citizen. So you can see that there's a major difference between what those two countries have to do to stabilize emissions. Here's another comparison. Perhaps it's a surprise to find that Switzerland, a European nation, has a lot more to do than China. And this is because it should be remembered that whilst China is responsible for about a quarter of the global emissions, they have a huge population and their factories are busy producing many of the phones and laptops and other products that are bought by people in Switzerland. This is just a sample. Of course, you can find out your own nation's number by either going to the website CUTx% or by downloading the app. Of course, you might be a bit curious about exactly how those numbers are calculated. The truth is, it's really pretty simple. You just get the carbon budget and you divide it per capita. But there are a few extra calculations involved. And this would explain the difference between the numbers in the CUTx index and those which you generally see in the media. And there are 3 things I'm going to point to. Number 1 is carbon capture. Now, in the CUTx numbers, those are not included. So what is carbon capture? Well, it's a bit like this. It's CO2 sucked out of the atmosphere with technology, just like this. But of course, my vacuum cleaner doesn't really work. It doesn't really suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And in fact, that's a little bit like the technology which we have. It doesn't work. The simple truth is we don't have carbon capture technology which is anywhere near the scale which people include in the numbers which are in the media. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the CUTx numbers calculate based on consumption, not territory. So like I mentioned with China, if I buy a laptop in Belgium, then those emissions are counted to Belgium, they're not counted to China. And thirdly, there's no overshoot in the numbers of the CUTx index. What that means is we don't allow the emissions to go over the budget for 1.5 or the budget for 2 degrees, because again, in the media, a lot of the calculations assume that we can do that, we can trespass over those thresholds and then somehow draw the numbers down at a later date. Now, that's of course in the first principle very dangerous, because you may already trigger those tipping points, and secondly, it's not fair on future generations. So these CUTx numbers are really very simple. They're based on the latest science, they're updated every year, and they should be informing policy. They should be used by the media to measure government's commitments. And so to finish, why are these numbers at a national level? What's the importance of national numbers? Well, they are at a national level because it avoids 2 critical problems in our climate thinking. The first problem it avoids is it gets us out of thinking about the climate crisis only at an individual level. We have individual carbon footprint calculators, something promoted by British Petroleum. And the fossil fuel industry, in a way, is happy to do that because it avoids the systems questions. It avoids questions of policy and questions of infrastructure. And when you look at those numbers, you can see now that we're into a level of change that is required, which goes far beyond what one individual can achieve. When doing the Writings on the Wall project, that's the reason for the slogan which goes on the picture. It's great to talk about human rights. It's great to bring to the surface the importance of tipping points and all of those things. But anytime we talk about climate change, we should have a clear statistical measure of where we're up to and what we have to do. So the image on the Writings on the Wall needs these numbers printed clearly for the public to start a proper discourse about where we're going. The second thing which it avoids is it avoids this very general thinking about climate change on a global level. We do indeed have a global problem, but the responsibility for dealing with it is not shared equally. And if we can only ever think in terms of the global budget, we're never going to get to a level of traction or a level of grip on the problem where things can actually change. Because if you think about media and political systems, where are they most focused? Where's the most grip that we have? And the answer is at a national level. We have national parliaments, national newspapers, national identities. It's an easy way to get a handle on the numbers and get policies implemented which can actually achieve something. Looking forward to chapter 5 now. It might seem a bit desperate. This is indeed a crisis. But the funny thing is that human civilization can suddenly and dramatically shift. It's happened in the past and it can happen in the future. And that is what chapter 5 is all about. In a sense, social tipping points.